Thank you very much for having me, Matt, and thank you for organizing this talk. Thanks as well to all of you all who are attending here tonight. It's nice to see a couple of fellow North Carolinians. Looks like Eric and Helen are from Durham, North Carolina. And nice to see my good friend Will Judy here from the Houston Oasis. Appreciate you joining and everyone else for joining tonight. So I'm Christopher Cameron, professor of history at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte, and interim chair of the Africana Studies department there. And I'll be talking tonight about Black Freethought from slavery to civil rights. This talk is based off of my 2019 book, Black Freethinkers, A History of African-American Secularism. So I'll go ahead and start my slides here. So here you can see the outline of the talk, but before I'd like to just talk a little bit about how I got interested in sort of researching this topic, how I got in this project and how it sort of developed into becoming the book that I published a few years ago. So I began working on this in 2012. This is my second book project. My first was a history of African-American abolitionists in Revolutionary era Massachusetts. I finished that book in 2012 and I was looking for a new project. But at the same time, I had also become an atheist probably 2 to 3 years ago. Wasn't any sort of dramatic thing. It was kind of a gradual evolution beginning in graduate school in 2006. So around 2011, 2012, I found myself sort of starting to search for atheist community, right? Just trying to find fellow atheists. I was connecting with folks on Twitter and Facebook and finding podcasts and blog posts and things like that. And I just started encountering a lot of material on historical Black atheists and agnostics. I came across the work of Professor Anthony Pinn at Rice University, who's published extensively on Black humanism. I found his wonderful collection called By These Hands, a documentary history of African-American humanism. So I started to see that there's quite a bit of primary source material documenting the history and the significance of Black atheism from the 19th century up through the end of the 20th century when Norm Allen Jr. created African Americans for Humanism. But what I was not finding was, aside from Professor Pinn's work, what I was not finding is any historical scholarship on this topic, right? I saw that there's a lot of sources, but people just, historians just weren't really doing a lot with those sources, and they weren't exploring what I thought was this really significant history. So for me, this project was really interesting blend of my own kind of personal proclivities or whatnot, my own sort of personal history and wanting to know more about people like me, about other African-American atheists. But, like I said, I was also looking for a next book project. I was an assistant professor at the time, trying to make tenure. So it was really sort of the perfect moment for me to kind of pick this up and run with it. And what I started with is doing research in slave narratives. I started reading all of the slave narratives that I could. And I had read quite a bit of slave narratives for my first book project, right, looking at Black abolitionists and slavery in colonial and revolutionary New England. But I started getting more into the 19th century slave narratives, and I started asking very different questions, because my first book was really a religious history. It was an exploration of how sort of Puritan theology shaped Black abolitionist thought. So when that's your project, you're reading slave narratives and looking for religious language. Now I was reading similar sources, but asking very different questions of those sources, right? What evidence can we find for the presence of atheism or deism or critiques of Christianity, right? just dissatisfaction with the prevailing religious order? How can we find that in these slave narratives? And I started to see across dozens and dozens of narratives, many of which are publicly available in the database documenting the American South, that there was a sort of bubbling up of atheism in the 19th century slave community, right? And this was very different from the secular movement that emerged among white intellectuals and revolutionaries such as Thomas Paine and Thomas Jefferson and folks like that, Robert Dale Owen, moving into the 19th century. Most of those people were deists. Most of those people still affirmed belief in God, right? It was a God that wasn't necessarily too involved in human life, right? But nevertheless, they still gave lip service to believing in one God, right, who created the world and let it run according to Isaac Newton's natural laws. And I found that within the slave community, free thought took a very different form from its inception, right? Like most of them weren't really engaging with deism, in large part because these are people who are denied access to literacy and to knowledge about this broader deist movement, right? But even though they were illiterate, even though they weren't very well versed in Enlightenment thought and secular thought of the time, they were nevertheless able to observe their world, to think about their lives, to reason, and to come to informed conclusions based off of their lived experiences. And their lived experiences were brutality, physical brutality, sexual assault, separation of families, being forced to labor from, before dawn till late at night. So in kind of reflecting on their lives, enslaved people came to see, many of them came to see and came to believe that there was no just God who was looking out for their interests, right? That there wasn't going to be a heaven for them, that this is all there was, and that the bit that they'd heard about Christianity simply wasn't true. One narrative that reflects on some of these ideas is that of Austin Steward, who published his work 22 Years a Slave and 40 Years a Freeman. He was enslaved in Virginia in the late 18th and through the early 19th century before gaining his freedom. And in his narrative, he talks about, he has this one really poignant moment where he's talking about his sister undergoing a brutal whipping. And he emphasizes the fact multiple times that this whipping happened on the Sabbath day. And he really wanted to draw that contrast for his readers, right? Like, here's a time where, if this were supposedly a Christian nation, we should all be going to church, we should be worshiping God, we should be loving our brothers and loving each other. But no, here we are on the Sabbath, he says, and my sister's being tied up and whipped and the flesh is being flayed from her back, right? And he follows this up by saying, by asking, right, can you wonder why we're doubting the sincerity of the white man's religion? Can you wonder why, or can you believe and understand why slaves do not believe in the God that you guys are telling us exists, right? So here we see this long-standing problem of evil coming to fore in the writings of these formerly enslaved people, right? If there is a just and all-knowing and all-wise God looking out for us, who's created the world, then why is there evil in the world? And for slaves specifically, why are we enslaved? Why are we undergoing these incredibly brutal conditions in a country that claims that it's one of the freest, if not the freest, in the world? We see kind of a bit of a different tack in another slave narrative, Slavery in the United States, published by Charles Ball in the 1830s. And Ball talks about one of the aspects of Black free thought that developed, namely a refusal to honor the Sabbath, right? So we see some slaves that are just not believing in God. Others are making sure that they're being sacrilegious, right? They're taking that non-belief to another level. Instead of, pretending that they're religious and going to church and paying lip service to Christianity, they're, working in their gardens on Sundays. They're making money in various ways, right? They're gambling, they're wrestling, they're getting drunk. But what they're not doing is they're not honoring the Sabbath, right? And Ball says this in part because he says that masters also don't care about their slaves' religious lives. So there's been sort of a misconception in a lot of the literature on African American religion that masters actually wanted to convert their slaves and try to do this. And recent historians, especially Daniel Fountain, who published a great book on slavery, salvation, and the Civil War, notes that most masters were incredibly loath to convert their slaves to Christianity, right? And Ball speaks to this in his narrative. So what we see during this era of slavery is not necessarily a widespread free thought movement, but we get individuals like Ball, like Austin Stewart, like Harriet Jacobs, and others that talk quite a bit in their slave narratives about the presence of free thought, the presence of atheism within the slave community. Now, there were a few individuals who would come out, unlike Ball or Stewart, who would come out and say that they themselves were atheists, agnostics, or free thinkers in some other way, right? So Frederick Douglass, in his second narrative, My Bondage and My Freedom, published in the 1850s, he talks about the fact that his religious views ranged from the most ardent Christianity to what he calls the blackest atheism. William Wells Brown is another individual who he was the first African-American novelist. He was a playwright. He was an abolitionist, leading Black intellectual of this time. And he was an agnostic. And he's somebody who, instead of just kind of talking about other enslaved people who were secular, he sort of talks about his own disregard for Christianity and his own agnosticism. He has one great line in his autobiography where he's discussing a prayer service that was going on in his master's house. He was enslaved in Kentucky. And he says, during these prayer meetings, I positioned myself right next to the mint julep because there was always pictures of mint julep there. And while everybody else had their eyes closed and were engaged in prayer, I partook freely of the julep. And he says, by the end of the session, I was as happy as anybody else there, right? Just one example of his kind of disregard, kind of like Ball is talking about, this disregard for the sacrality of religion and of Christianity. Now, where we would start to get more of a Black secular movement is during the era of the Harlem Renaissance, which is a cultural and intellectual movement that started in the late 19-teens, early 1920s. And would really help to forward the progress of Black free thought in the United States. Now, the Harlem Renaissance grew in part out of the Great Migration to the North, whereby approximately 1.5 million Black Southerners moved from the rural South to the urban North. They moved to cities like Chicago and Detroit, Philadelphia, Cleveland, and New York City. Right. And one of the reasons why the Harlem Renaissance is so important is because it brought together these scattered individual freethinkers from the South, from the Midwest, from areas where they couldn't necessarily be open about their secularism, right? A couple of examples are listed down here at the bottom: Zora Neale Hurston and Langston Hughes. So Langston Hughes, in his autobiography, The Big C, talks about growing up in Joplin, Missouri, being raised in a very religious household, in a very religious community, and basically being forced to kind of fake a conversion during his teenage years. And he talks about how this sort of moment where he faked this conversion was actually the moment where he stopped believing in God, right? And that's kind of a persistent theme in the writings of a number of Black secular thinkers. Zora Neale Hurston kind of discusses this a bit as well as James Forman, who I'll get to a little bit later. So you have people like Langston Hughes from Joplin, Missouri, Zora Neale Hurston from Eatonville, Florida, where she grew up as the daughter of the local Baptist preacher, right? So of course, she couldn't be open about her secularism. And in her autobiography, Dust Tracks on a Road, she talks about the fact that she was always really scared to share her questionings and her doubts that arose when she was 11 and 12 years old, because she felt that she'd be ostracized by her community. But when these individuals move up north, when they start attending these Ivy League institutions like Columbia University, where both Langston Hughes and Zora Neale Hurston went, when they start interacting with other sort of avant-garde artists and intellectuals and the like, and just being exposed to more of a cosmopolitan atmosphere, now they can start to build more of a secular community, right? So that's one of the really significant aspects of the Harlem Renaissance, as well as the fact that Black writing was much more heavily supported during this time period. There are a number of sort of literary patrons of the Black arts during the Harlem Renaissance. So on a very practical level, there are now much more publishing opportunities, and freethinkers like Hughes and Hurston and others used poetry, they used novels, they used autobiographies, newspaper articles, essays, other forms of writing to articulate their secularism, to critique Christianity, and to start to build community with other freethinkers. Now, Nella Larsen was one of the most important secular thinkers of this time period. And her views come out most strongly in her 1928 novel, Quicksand. She was one of the first African-American women to publish a novel. And Quicksand is incredibly important for its treatment and critique of Christianity, its exploration of secularism, and its critique of the sort of standard gender and sexual mores of the period, especially the notion that sort of the goal for women should be marriage and kids, right? That's sort of the ultimate goal for them, right? And this novel really undermined that in a number of ways. So the protagonist of the novel is a woman named Helga Crane, and the book opens up with her. She's a teacher at a school called Naxos, an anagram of Saxon, which is basically a composite of two schools that Nella Larsen went to, Fisk University and Tuskegee University. It opens with them listening to a sermon from a white preacher who is saying, who's basically praising Naxos Negroes because they know their place, right? They know that they shouldn't be agitating for social change. They're good, respectable Black people, and she can't stand that. So Helga Crane ends up leaving the school. She goes to Chicago, and she's trying to sort of find her way in Chicago, find a job, place to live, all of that. So she goes to one of the largest Black churches in the city, thinking, well, this is a place where I can sort of start to build a life for myself. I can meet people. I can build some sense of a community. She's basically spurned by everybody there. Nobody pays any attention to her. They don't care about her. And this is really symbolic for her of the kind of emptiness of Christianity, right? Like if you're not in that in group already, then it's going to be really hard to get into it, right? From there, she goes to Harlem and eventually ends up marrying a revival preacher named Reverend Mr. Pleasant Green. He was a revival preacher from Alabama, who was loosely based off of Nella Larsen's own relatives. So Larsen was married to a physicist named Samuel Imes, and he was from Alabama, right? And his family was a very prominent revival family in Alabama. So she marries the Reverend, moves down to Alabama, has a bunch of kids in succession, right? 4 kids in 3 years, including a set of twins. After the 4th kid, she's basically laid up on her deathbed, wondering what exactly she's done with her life, right? Just, a couple of years before this, she was in Harlem, right? During, the Great Migration, people moving up to Harlem, the Renaissance is going on. Life was good. She was single, going to parties, having fun. And now she's sort of trapped in domesticity, and she's basically kind of critiquing this standard heteronormative path in life that's outlined for Black women. And for her, she ties that very clearly to her acceptance of Christianity, right? And by the end of the novel, she's very clear in her belief that God does not exist, and wondering why Black people would ever believe in God, given everything that they've experienced in the United States of America. Zora Neale Hurston was another key Black freethinker of the Harlem Renaissance era. I mentioned that Hurston grew up in Eatonville, Florida, the daughter of a preacher, right? She was part of the Great Migration too. She first moved to Washington, D.C., where she attended Howard University, studied with another Black freethinker, Alain Locke there, who's widely known or hailed as the father of the Harlem Renaissance. She then moved to New York, where she studied anthropology at Columbia University with a white freethinker, Franz Boas, right? So 2 of her key academic and intellectual mentors were both freethinkers, right? And Hurston articulated her own secular beliefs in a number of different genres, one in her anthropological writings, another in her novels, right? So Their Eyes Were Watching God, of course, her most famous novel, has very similar themes as Nella Larsen's Quicksand, right? Namely, a critique of this kind of standard heteronormative path in life for women, right? And her autobiography, Dust Tracks on a Road, gets into sort of her own religious beliefs and is her sort of first person critique of traditional religious ideas. Here you can see a bit of influence of the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, where she's saying basically only weak people need religion, right? In other parts of the autobiography, she would kind of move back and forth between deist and agnostic views, right? Saying, well, I'm not really sure that there is a God, but if there is, there's no point in praying to this God or doing anything like that, because he's probably so far removed from us that he doesn't really care. So she would be another kind of key freethinker during this time period. So the Harlem Renaissance lasted from roughly 1919 up through 1935. It emerged in part as a sort of underhanded or kind of backhanded way of fighting racism, of combating racism, right? So 1919 was the year of the infamous Red Summer, where there were race riots throughout the country, right? So a number of Black intellectuals became a little bit fearful of overt political action. So the Harlem Renaissance and Black writings and art became a way of using sort of Black genius and accomplishment to undermine racism without overt political agitation, right? Well, other Black activists and intellectuals during this time period uh, were not scared of that overt action, right? And they actually embraced even more radical forms of political thought and political activity during this time period. And from the 19 teens up through the 1940s, you start to see a kind of close tie between African American free thought and socialism and communism, right? Now, both socialists and communists were appealing to African Americans for a number of reasons, right? One was the anti-imperialism of socialists and communists, right, and their support for independence of African nations. In the late 1920s, that sort of anti-imperialism also extended to African Americans with the creation of what was known as the Black Belt Thesis in 1928, whereby the Communist Party recognized African Americans as a nation within a nation that had the same right to self-determination as other nations throughout Europe and throughout Africa. So they're really drawn to the sort of anti-colonialism and anti-imperialism of the socialists and communists. They like the fact that the communists in the early 1930s supported the Scottsboro Boys, a group of African-American men who were falsely accused of rape in Alabama. And for those African Americans who had already become atheists or agnostics, they were drawn to political ideologies and to political parties that themselves had refuted Christianity and had embraced atheism. Indeed, the Comintern, the Communist International in 1926, put out a directive stating to worldwide communists that they basically expect all communists to be atheists, right? And that directive was put into place in local branches throughout the world, and especially throughout the United States. So you would be highly ridiculed and ostracized if you tried to go to a communist meeting and they knew that you were a member of a Christian church or even attended a Christian church. So some of the prominent Black communist freethinkers of the 1920s and the 1930s were Louise Thompson Patterson, pictured here, Hubert Harrison, towering Black intellectual. Harry Haywood was probably the most prominent Black communist of the 1920s and the 1930s. And I mentioned he was the one who came up with that Black Belt Thesis. W.E.B. Du Bois would start to embrace communism in the 1920s. He had become a socialist during his time studying abroad in Germany in the late 1890s. And after traveling to the Soviet Union a couple of times during the 1920s, he would sort of move from socialism towards communism. And the end of his life, he would identify as a communist. And that's one of the reasons he ended up leaving the United States and repatriating to Ghana. Elizabeth Hendrickson was kind of similar to Hubert Harrison and being one of the most well-known speakers and intellectuals in New York City during the 1920s. Cyril Briggs was the founder and leader of an organization called the African Blood Brotherhood, which was basically a Black communist organization that promoted anti-imperialism and anti-colonialism, as well as endeavored to teach African Americans self-defense. And Richard Wright, the novelist, was also a communist. So Richard Wright published a number of well-known works, including his book Native Son. In his autobiography, Black Boy, the central theme of this book is his sort of growing critiques of Christianity and embrace by, kind of halfway through the book, his embrace of atheism, right? So Richard Wright grew up with his grandmother and aunt in Mississippi. They were both Seventh-day Adventists, so he was raised in a very religious household, and he was always clashing with them over this issue of religion. And finally, by the time he was 16 years old, he accepted the fact that he just did not believe in God. And he was another person who had one of these kind of fake conversion experiences where he was up on the mourner's bench in the church during a revival service. His mother's in front of him saying, come to Jesus, Richard. Don't you love your mother? Don't you love your family? And he sort of fakes this conversion, but later when he's talking to his friends, he says, we didn't really feel anything, right? And they all agreed. W.B. Du Bois, I mentioned, also another Black socialist, then communist, and a freethinker who used the pages of the Crisis magazine, the organ of the NAACP, to articulate his critiques of both the Black church and of American Christianity, and who also stated his own secular beliefs and his doubts in the afterlife in his autobiography published posthumously in 1968. And W.B. Du Bois lived such a long life. He was born in 1863. The first Black man to receive a PhD in history from Harvard in 1895, would live until 1963. So he really spans like the entirety of my book almost, right? He's born just after slavery, one of the key figures in both the Harlem Renaissance and the socialist and communist movements, and would live through much of the kind of traditional civil rights movement. Which the normal periodization of this movement is beginning in 1954 and going through 1968. It's often portrayed in both historical scholarship, in popular culture, in the media. We're probably seeing a lot of this during Black History Month. It's portrayed as a religious movement dominated by religious figures like the Reverend Ralph Abernathy and Martin Luther King Jr., Fannie Lou Hamer, and others. But the fact of the matter is, and Barbara Savage shows this with really great statistical analysis in her book, Your Spirits Walk Beside Us, The Politics of Black Religion, she shows that less than 10% of churches in the South participated openly in civil rights activity, right? And she has this great line in the book where she says, the fact that we've come to associate the civil rights movement with religion is a miracle in and of itself, right? And so when you look at most churches and most religious institutions, they were either conservative or they were scared of racial violence and retribution, right? So many Black churches simply did not think it was the function of the church to save people's lives in this world, right? To improve their lives in this world. They thought the function of the church was to get you into heaven in the next world. If they could save your soul, they had done their job, right? So that's the sort of conservatism of many Black churches. But others, even if they did share the liberalism of churches like Martin Luther King's Ebenezer Baptist Church, even if they shared that proclivity towards activism, they were scared of racial violence and retaliation from the KKK. And, who can really blame them, right? With the prevalence of lynching and its increase in the United States after 1915. So we can see that, there's certainly religion is important in the civil rights movement, but that's not the only story of the civil rights movement. The civil rights movement and the later Black Power movement would be heavily influenced by Black secular thinkers such as Stokely Carmichael, pictured here, and James Forman. So Stokely Carmichael and James Forman were part of the sort of traditional civil rights movement, right? So they were both members of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. James Forman was its executive secretary. Stokely Carmichael was elected president of SNCC after John Lewis, right? But eventually they would come to sort of reject participation in that mainstream civil rights movement, and they would embrace what they started to call Black Power, which began right around 1966 as a way to sort of improve the political and economic conditions of African American communities. Black power would heavily inform and would sort of see its institutional expression in the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense, also formed in 1966 as a response to persistent police brutality and the killing of unarmed Black men in Oakland, California, and the Bay Area more broadly. The Black Panther Party was explicitly started by Huey Newton and Bobby Seale as a humanist political organization where African Americans would take control of their own destinies without relying on belief in a deity who would do things for them, but they would do things for themselves, including starting health clinics, including their most popular program, the free breakfast program for children, which spread throughout the country. They would fund ambulance services and other forms of medical care. They would train people for jobs. One of the most important and visible aspects of the Black Panther Party was their teaching and advocacy of Black self-defense. And here they were following in part the philosophy of Malcolm X, right, who said that Black people need to get guns and they need to defend themselves if they are the victims of racial violence in the United States. So you'd see them sort of, they started to do this thing called policing the police, where rather than the police following them around, they would follow the police around, right? And they would have, they would take advantage of their Second Amendment rights. They would openly carry shotguns around their shoulders. They would stand the requisite amount of space behind the police and make sure that they were not engaging in racial violence against members of their community. Now, Huey Newton, Eldridge Cleaver, David Hilliard, and a number of other individuals in the national organization and leaders of local Black Panther Party chapters rejected Christianity. They rejected the philosophy of nonviolence of the mainstream civil rights movement. And many of them were atheists, humanists, and secularists, and they used their newspaper called the Black Panther to articulate some of these humanist and secular ideas. I'll finish up with a discussion of the Black arts movement. So this was sort of the kind of cultural and artistic wing of the Black Power movement. The Black Panther Party is the political wing. Black arts movement is the kind of cultural wing. And some of the key writers of the Black arts movement would be James Baldwin, Lorraine Hansberry, and others. This movement started around the mid-1960s, went up through the mid-1970s, and accepted some of the main tenets of the Black Power movement, including cultural nationalism, which basically means that they started to reject Western culture and Western mores, right? They started to reject things like being clean shaven. They started to wear beards. They started to reject short hair. That's why they were wearing afros. They started to wear their hair in naturals, right? They started to wear African clothes. And another of the kind of central elements of Western culture that they began to reject was Christianity. This doesn't mean all of them became atheist or agnostics, right? Many of them, like Maulana Karenga, who started Kwanzaa, turned to sort of African spiritualities and African religions during this time, but a number of other thinkers, especially Lorraine Hansberry, pictured here, and James Baldwin, use their writings like The Fire Next Time or Raisin Under the Sun in the case of Hansberry to articulate their rejection of Christianity and their acceptance of atheism or agnosticism. So, historical scholarship, especially the scholarship on African American religion, on American religion more broadly, is often portrayed Black people as naturally religious, right, or as overly religious. But I show in my book, Black Freethinkers, and I hope I've shown tonight that free thought has been a critical component of African-American culture and African-American political life from the 19th century up through the civil rights era. This is a history, like I noted at the beginning of the talk, that is very accessible, right? Google the works of Anthony Pinn, and you're going to find a lot of, published primary sources. So yes, I did some archival research down in Atlanta, in Chicago, up at the Schomburg Center in New York. But I didn't have to go into the archives nearly as much for this book as I did for my first book, because so many of these Black atheists and agnostics were well-known writers and activists and intellectuals who published their works, right? So their works are very accessible and available to a broader public. And I think it's really important to kind of spread information about this as widely as possible, in part to correct historical misunderstandings about African-American culture, but also to show contemporary Black atheists and agnostics who may be feeling a little isolated themselves in religious families and religious communities, that they're part of a very long and prominent tradition of African-American secularism. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Chris, for that talk. And we already have some questions in the Q&A, so y'all are welcome to keep putting questions in the Q&A. But for right now, I think we can start with, if many slaves did not believe in God, how did the Christian religion become so popular to the African-American slave?
Sure. So Christianity took root in slave communities for a couple of reasons. One was really pragmatic, and this is what I talk about in my first book, where using religious language and building alliances with religious people, with ministers, with abolitionists and the like, was a really effective way to fight against the institution of slavery, right? And that was the case from the late 18th century. So there was that really pragmatic component, right? Other enslaved people rejected the sermons and the religious messages that they were getting from white preachers and from their masters, and fashioned a Christianity that combined elements of African spirituality with Christianity. So in a way, they kind of made the religion their own, right? Now, I don't think, I certainly wouldn't say that atheism was as prominent as Christianity during the 19th century, but I think we can't ignore it like most scholars have done, right? And then once you get past the Civil War, then African Americans start to think, well, slavery has ended, right? Maybe there is actually a God who's looking out for us.
Were masters not interested in converting their enslaved people because they did not consider them to be fully human?
Yeah, that's certainly part of it, right? Some didn't consider their enslaved people to be human. By law, most enslaved people were treated as property, right? But there were other elements of it too. So I found, some masters reflecting on the fact that if they convert their slaves, then are they going to have to see them in heaven? And is that going to be an awkward situation for them? So there's that. And then there's also sort of the liberatory and revolutionary messages in Christianity, right? So a lot of masters didn't want their slaves to know about Moses leading the Israelites out of Egyptian bondage, and some of the messages of Jesus in the New Testament talking about breaking chains and things like that. There are a number of elements in the Bible that can be highly critical of kind of contemporary slavery. So they thought that could be sort of dangerous. And in the hands of folks like Nat Turner, it certainly was, right?
We have a lot of questions coming in, so we'll try to cover as much as we can. There's another question about whether enslavers presented Christianity to slaves, or did they obscure the story? So I think you covered that well. And so we got recognition of that. Let's see. And Chris, you're welcome to look at the list of questions and take any that you want to. But I'll go back to how is it that this logical response to slavery and the master's religion has led to the incredible devotion to Christianity still strong among African Americans today?
Yeah. So, like I mentioned, after the Civil War, adherence to Christianity started to grow by leaps and bounds, in part because African Americans started to identify themselves with the Israelites, right? And they felt that they had been sort of led out of Egyptian bondage, right? So prior to the Civil War, about half of African Americans were Christians. And many still practiced traditional African religions or voodoo or things like that, right? That started to change after the Civil War. And one of the things you see is a massive explosion in Black churches after the Civil War. And Black churches were not just religious organizations, and they're still not, right? They were political organizations. So when African Americans got the right to vote, they would gather together, the whole communities would gather together in churches, and they would discuss which political candidates they would vote for, right? And even Black women who couldn't vote themselves would try to sort of would discuss with men and try to convince them who they should vote for. So they're political organizations. Schools were often held in Black churches, right? This is oftentimes where you went to socialize. So these were really, in many ways, the centers of Black communities and one of the few safe spaces that they had, right? And so that's why there's always, there's been such pressure to sort of conform to Christianity within African American communities, right? And that pressure is only sort of ramped up after the civil rights movement with this sort of view of the centrality of these churches in this movement that helped to undermine segregation and Jim Crow in the United States.
Was there often conflict between the Black secularists and the pragmatically religious people you mentioned pre-emancipation?
No, there really wasn't, in part because there weren't a ton of Black secularists who were really open about their secularism, right? I mentioned there were a few here and there, right? Frederick Douglass and William Wells Brown, but most didn't kind of harp on it quite a bit, right? Or they didn't really start to be particularly open about it until after the Civil War. So yeah, no, there wasn't really a ton of conflict between them. And while they might have shared, or while they might have kind of had different religious beliefs, they had a very shared goal in achieving the abolition of slavery and fighting for racial equality.
I'll kind of combine these two questions. Was Bayard Rustin an atheist? And do you think some of these activists were driven to secularism by being members of a sexual minority?
Yeah. So of course he was a gay man. He was a Quaker and an atheist. Yes, and certainly being part of a sexual minority, LGBTQ African Americans have been drawn towards atheism, right? So that was the case, of course, with James Baldwin, and he talks about this in autobiographical writings. He explores this a bit in his novel Giovanni's Room, right? So yeah, this, being sort of spurned by Black churches, by the Black community for their sexuality has often pushed African Americans away from Christianity and towards Freethought.
Can you comment on cross-fertilization between white and Black freethinkers?
Yeah, certainly. So you start to see this quite a bit more towards the end of the 19th century, not so much prior to slavery. I mentioned that Freethought developed along kind of very different tracks, right? But once you get sort of past the Civil War, African Americans are able to go to school, they're going to college, they're gaining literacy, right? They're able to start to read these secular papers and engage with the sort of broader American culture. You certainly do start to see a lot of ties between white and Black freethinkers, right? So there's one Black freethinker named David Sinclair, who attended secular conventions and was known in the late 19th century as the Black Bob Ingersoll. There's a man named Lord Nelson in San Francisco who wrote articles for the Truth Seeker. Hubert Harrison in the early 20th century, who I mentioned, he also wrote articles for the Truth Seeker and participated in Thomas Paine Day celebrations with secularists in New York. So yeah, certainly there was quite a bit of connections there, but at the same time, there were many white freethinkers who felt that who kind of shared the sort of racist views of the broader American society, right? And this is especially the case with folks like D.M. Bennett, who was the editor of the Truth Seeker, who was a virulent racist. And many white freethinkers and leaders of the secular movement during this time didn't think that African Americans had the intellectual capacity to understand atheism and agnosticism, right? So this view of Black people being naturally religious, that comes just as much from white religious thinkers as from white freethinkers in the 19th century.
You mentioned Robert Ingersoll, sorry, and there was a question of did many Black people know about him in the 1800s? They assume very few would have been allowed into his audiences.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, no, absolutely. A lot of Black people did know about him. Frederick Douglass, in fact, was friends with Bob Ingersoll, right? So Susan Jacoby talks about this in her biography of Ingersoll. I talk about this a little bit in chapter 1 of Black Freethinkers too. So yeah, absolutely. Many of them knew of him and were great admirers of him.
Did Frederick Douglass make a complete transition to secularism by the end of his life?
He's really hard to pin down. He kind of goes back and forth, in part because he so often, even after he became the president of this, or vice president of an organization called the Free Religious Association, which aimed to promote sort of a humanist religion in the late 19th century. It grew out of sort of Unitarianism and Transcendentalism in Boston. But even after taking part in the Free Religious Association, he would still often use this language of like providence and use language that suggested he believed in God, but at other times he was very clearly stating kind of deist and secular views, right? So in 1870, 5 years after the end of the Civil War, there was the final meeting of the American Anti-Slavery Society, right? And this was, some of the leading abolitionists in the country, people who had helped to bring down slavery and secure passage of the 13th Amendment. And so many of them were getting up and thanking God for freeing the slaves. And Frederick Douglass gets up and he's like, for my part, I don't want to thank God. I want to thank men. I want to thank the men and women who ran away from their masters and who sort of forced the hand of Lincoln to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. It's only through such men that I can get a glimpse of God, right? So that's not exactly atheist, right? It's not exactly like agnostic or anything like that, but it's certainly like transcendentalist, and they believe that like God is sort of within us, not this like entity outside of us. He was a great admirer of the transcendentalist minister Theodore Parker. So yeah, I wouldn't say he made sort of a complete transition to secularism, but nevertheless, I feel very comfortable calling him a Black freethinker for his intense doubts of Christianity and his very strong critiques of the ties between Christianity and racism in American society.
Mm-hmm. ML King and Huey Newton or Bobby Seale are often, ML King is often better remembered than Huey Newton or Bobby Seale. To what extent is this because of the latter's views on religion?
I mean, I think quite a bit, right? So yeah, I mean, we've tended to downplay or ignore secularists within African American history, or if we discuss them, we ignore their secularism, right? So a lot of the people that I've talked about, tonight, and that I discuss in the book, like I mentioned at the end, they're very well-known people, right? Lorraine Hansberry and James Foreman and Baldwin and Richard Wright, like we know their works. They've been, turned into movies and all of that. But there isn't a lot of scholarship that discusses the influence of secularism on their works, right? So absolutely, I think Huey Newton's and Bobby Seale's and others' religious beliefs played a role in us sort of trying not to remember them quite as much as Martin Luther King Jr. But right alongside that, and I think this is kind of related to their secularism, is their advocacy of Black self-defense and arming Black people, which white Americans have generally not been comfortable with, right? Even those who are strong supporters of the Second Amendment, even those who might be part of the NRA, they still don't like Black people defending themselves and organizing to protect their own communities because they want to be able to treat us with impunity and do whatever they want, right?
Yeah. Well, I think we're getting close to time, but I'd like to give Chris, do you have any final thoughts or any other questions in the chat that you'd like to address?
Let's see. No, nothing else that I think I haven't addressed already. Okay, so the higher proportion of Blacks are Christian than whites, 80% to 60%. I think I kind of addressed that a little bit in this sort of cultural ties to religion, in part because of these views of its importance in the Black community, but also just the centrality of churches as kind of political, educational, social, even vocational institutions within Black communities, right? And also, as I kind of alluded to throughout the talk, yes, a lot of Black people say that they're Christians and give lip service to Christianity, but how many of those are really telling the truth, right? How many are, we have all of these examples throughout history of these kind of fake conversions, right? And of people sort of aligning themselves with religious communities without actually believing in the religious ideas, right? So how many of these people are going to church and calling themselves Christians, but they're really doing it because that's just what you do as a Black person on Sunday morning, right? Not necessarily because they believe in the theology. So yes, the surveys and the censuses and all of that are going to show a higher percentage of Black people are Christians than whites. I'm not sure that percentage is as high as what's being reported. But also it is a really central institution in Black communities. I'll just end by saying thank you so much to everybody who's attended. It's really great to engage with you. I really appreciate these questions. Like I mentioned, I'm a professor at University of North Carolina at Charlotte. My email is available on the history department's website, so feel free to reach out if you have any other questions.
Thank you so much for being here, Chris. And shout out the name of your book again as well.
Black Freethinkers, A History of African American Secularism.
All right. Thank you so much for being here. This has been really edifying for all of us, I'm sure. I just want to let people know we do have more webinars coming up this semester. You can check out secularstudents.org/webinars and see what we have coming up. We have a talk on evolution. We have a panel discussion on the struggle for abortion rights with a number of abortion rights activists. And we even have a secular Seder to celebrate the liberation story of Exodus in a secular way, because we don't need God to celebrate that kind of story of liberation. So hope to see you all there. Thank you again, Chris, and y'all have a good evening.